Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference titled Exploitation by Exposure, Human Rights and Toxic Exposures with United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics, Baskut Tuncak. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. And you can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. As I mentioned before, I sent a link to our presenter slides a few hours ago, and the slides are also available on our homepage at akaction.org. Take a moment to download them if you haven't already done so. And keep in mind that this is an audio-only teleconference, not a webinar, so you will need to click through the document yourself to follow along. Our call will last about an hour, and we'll have some time towards the end for questions and comments. At this time, maybe I should just ask really quickly, Baskut, are you able to stay a little bit late because we started late, or do we need to end promptly at the top of the hour?
No, I'm happy to stay as long as there are questions.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and go over a little bit, and I hope that works well for our participants. I just want to make sure that there is time for discussion. So we were unsure if we would be able to secure Baskut as a speaker this spring due to scheduling challenges, so we're very grateful that he agreed to participate from Turkey between his travel to remote areas, and we're sorry about the technical difficulties this morning. As an environmental health and justice organization that believes everyone has a right to clean air, clean water, and toxic-free food, we at Alaska Community Action on Toxics are especially eager to hear from our speaker today about the human rights implications of exposures to industrial chemicals, pesticides, and other hazardous substances and wastes. And so with that, it is my honor to formally introduce and welcome our speaker for today, Baskut Tuncak. Mr. Baskut Tuncak is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the implications for human rights of the environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and wastes, otherwise and more simply known as the Special Rapporteur on Toxics. Mr. Tuncak was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2014, and his mandate was renewed in 2017 for 3 more years. He is the first mandate holder to explore in detail the full range of implications for human rights of hazardous substances throughout their life cycle, that is, production, transportation, storage, use, and disposal. Mr. Tuncak is an international lawyer specializing in laws and policies on the management of toxic chemicals and pollution. He is the founder of Common Rights, a multidisciplinary advisory firm on environmental health, sustainable development, and human rights. And from 2009 to 2016, he was senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law. Prior to his legal career, Mr. Tuncak worked as a synthetic chemist with various chemical and biotechnology companies. And in addition, he has served in various advisory roles to both governmental and non-governmental initiatives. And I don't want to go on because I want to make sure that he has plenty of time to share his expertise with us. So welcome, Baskut. It's an honor to have you speak on our call today. Thank you so much for being here. You may go ahead and begin.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And well, hello again, everyone. My name is Baskut Tuncak. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. So I guess I'd like to begin with just a question, which is somewhat of a long-standing question, and that is, what exactly is a human right? This, of course, varies from country to country and region to region. We can find many different interpretations and definitions of what exactly is a human right. Someone once defined it to me as something that you would give your life or your freedom to defend. And although this is somewhat simplistic, I think there's a lot of truth to this. And today we certainly see that it holds true for a healthy environment. People around the world are risking their life and their freedom to protect their water, their food, their homes, their health, their dignity, as well as the lives of their children and future generations from the direct threats of pollution, contamination, toxic exposures, or environmental degradation more generally. This, in my view, it's a clear intersection of human rights and toxics, where defenders of environmental rights are being targeted, harassed, attacked, or even in some tragic cases, killed. However, we also have to look at the root cause of why we have environmental human rights defenders today, and why in many countries they are facing a crisis. In my view, part of the reason that we have this crisis is that we continue to exploit the most vulnerable in society by externalizing the toxic impacts of consumption and production on them, and patterns of consumption and production that are simply unsustainable. Furthermore, we've failed to hold those responsible accountable. We've allowed environmental and human rights discourses to be divided and conquered, so to speak. And in addition, I would have to say that we've slowly allowed our human rights to be eroded through insidious and relentless exposures to toxic substances through essentially every medium that we come into contact with. This slow erosion of human rights, this exploitation of our rights, and the fragmentation of environmental efforts and human rights efforts in different arenas has been a large part of what I have focused on in trying to address in my past work as UN Special Rapporteur for the past 5 years. And so that's essentially what I'll be discussing here with you in the course of my presentation. So next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit of background on the mandate on human rights and toxics. The mandate is actually one of the oldest mandates on a specific thematic issue that was created by the UN, previously the Commission on Human Rights and what is now the Human Rights Council. It was created on the issue of transboundary dumping of waste, particularly by wealthier countries and poorer countries, and it was created in the mid-1990s. However, it has evolved considerably over the past 20 some odd years, nearly 25 years of its existence. And part of its evolution tracks with the evolution of how we have addressed environmental issues, which is to take a life cycle approach to the issue of hazardous substances and wastes. In the slide, you see a ship, and some of you might be familiar with this ship and the case that it represents. The case is that of the Probo koala. The Probo koala was owned and operated by one of the world's largest commodity trading companies, a firm called Trafigura, which is headquartered in Europe. And it had an idea to do a very toxic process on board its ship that it couldn't get the necessary permits to do on land in order to maximize profits. And what ended up happening is that the company couldn't dispose of the waste in Europe for a price that it found reasonable. So it sailed the ship around the Mediterranean and the north coast of Africa and down the west coast of Africa until it found a place where it could get a price for its waste, for disposing its waste, that it found to be acceptable. And the place that it found to dispose of the waste was in the city of Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, using a company called Tommy Limited. And this company, by all reports, has very little to no experience in the disposal of hazardous waste, and it decided to dispose of the waste in a number of dump sites in the city of Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. And tragically, a number of people died, over 15 people, And according to Amnesty International, 100,000 people in the city of Abidjan sought medical assistance for exposure to the toxic waste. Now, I mention the case because this case is just one of many cases that that has led the African group to have a strong interest in the mandate on toxics. Since its inception, the African group has been drawing attention to how developing countries have borne the brunt of many environmental harms and toxic harms that have been created over the years. But this case was in 2006, and what it did was it sparked an evolution of the mandate. So now the mandate is known not only on toxic waste, but hazardous substances and waste, and it covers the full life cycle of industrial activities, from extraction to manufacturing, to energy production, agricultural production, consumer products containing toxic chemicals, and of course still the issue of waste. Essentially any and all activities that could give rise to the exposure of toxic substances or have other human rights impacts related to hazardous substances and wastes fall within the scope of the mandate. So next slide, please. Just briefly, I'd like to maybe present a few of some of the work that I've been doing under the mandate in the past several years. One of the things that I do as a mandate holder is present an annual report to the UN. First, it was to the UN Human Rights Council, but since last year, it has also included a presentation to the UN General Assembly. These reports touch on any thematic issue that I feel is important to highlight, and so I've touched on a number of issues that you can see in the slide, and then some of the reports that'll be forthcoming later this year are also mentioned. In addition, I take country visits, on average 2 per year, to countries on their invitation to either do fact-finding missions or to have discussions with them on good practices and strengthening protections of human rights. And in addition, we're also able to receive allegations as mandate holders, as special rapporteurs or independent experts. We're able to receive allegations from victims of alleged violations or abuses of human rights, and engage in a confidential communication process with states and businesses to try to resolve outstanding concerns. So next slide, please. One of the ways in which that I found human rights to be a useful tool is as a narrative. And as we all know, narratives can be extraordinarily powerful. And I found that the human rights narrative around toxics to at times be quite powerful. I think in terms of human rights, this is only one of the ways in which we can use human rights in terms of trying to advance a healthy environment. And one of the other ways, of course, is to use the rights that are contained. But first, I want to touch on the narrative aspect, which I think is underappreciated. So next slide. For example, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child contains numerous provisions that are directly implicated by childhood exposure to toxic substances. So, for example, under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, every child has the highest attainable standard of health, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, and every state correspondingly has a duty to protect every child's right to the highest attainable standard of health, taking into account the dangers and risks of water contamination, food contamination, dirty air, and other factors that can affect the child's right to health. In addition, every child has the right to bodily integrity, to life, to survival, maximum development, to be heard, and other human rights that, in my view, help to craft a very useful narrative around what many pediatricians have referred to as a silent pandemic of diseases and disabilities that are affecting the rights of children, the rights of children to life, to survival, to maximum development, and many of the others that I just mentioned. Over 190 countries have an implicit duty under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, under its various provisions, to prevent toxic exposure. Furthermore, they have an explicit obligation to ensure that the best interests of the child is a primary consideration when they enact and enforce and implement environmental laws and policies that have direct bearing on children's health, development, and survival. In many ways, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is, in my view, one of the most underutilized environmental treaties that we have today at the global level, both in terms of its legal provisions, but then also in terms of the narrative that it can help to craft. For example, children are being pre-polluted, and this directly implicates how they are being deprived of their rights to life, to health, to development, and to have their best interests taken into account. So next slide, please. Some of you may be familiar with a case in South Korea that continues to unfold over recent years. For those that aren't familiar with it, it's a case involving a number of companies that sold essentially a chemical product to be used as a humidifier sterilizer, a chemical mixture that would be added to the water tanks and was marketed to be a healthy solution to help stop bacterial growth in humidifiers. Humidifiers are quite popular in Korea and viewed as part of creating a healthy indoor environment. However, very, very unfortunately, the companies that were marketing these humidifier sterilizers failed to conduct due diligence on the toxicity of the chemicals that they were marketing to be added to humidifier sterilizers, and tragically, as a result, what is now estimated as over 1,000 victims who tragically have died as a result of exposure to the toxic chemicals that were released into the indoor environment. Recent figures from the Ministry of Environment in Korea suggest that there may have been hundreds of thousands of people whose health had been harmed by exposure to these toxic humidifier sterilizers. And the government is still in the process of unfolding exactly what the extent is of the victims. Most of the victims were unfortunately young children and women who were either pregnant or had recently given birth, and elderly persons as well, demonstrating the extreme vulnerability of certain age groups and genders to toxic exposures. Now, this case did not essentially turn on human rights. However, in addressing this case during my visit to South Korea, and in speaking about the case subsequently, what I've found is that the human rights narrative has been quite useful in terms of conveying to the public about what has happened in this case, which is an unquestionable violation of human rights. Although the case wasn't decided on by a court on the grounds of human rights, the human rights narrative has, in my view, been extraordinarily useful in terms of explaining the implications of this case, not just in Korea, but for countries around the world. So next slide, please. But as I alluded to earlier, human rights are much more than a narrative. They're essentially rights. They are inalienable rights of everyone, and they represent universally shared values and principles that the governments have committed themselves to respect, to protect, and to fulfill. A human right, however, is only truly a right if it is actionable. If any, and I mean any, right holder can seek and obtain redress for a violation. Rights holders must be able to claim their rights in order to legitimately be able to say that these are human rights. They must have access to effective remedies for violations of human rights. Next slide, please. There is essentially no shortage of human rights that are implicated by toxic exposures or a toxic environment more generally. These rights, in my view, create an opportunity to advance a non-toxic environment in all countries. Every country, with no exception, has human rights obligations relating to environmental quality. However, there are challenges in realizing most of these rights, especially the substantive rights, such as the right to life, the right to health, the right to safe water, the right to safe food, to adequate housing, and so forth. For example, over 150 countries have recognized the right to a healthy environment, which is first a wonderful narrative, but also an incredibly powerful and useful right if properly implemented. But in practice, rather than being a right, the right, so-called right to a healthy environment has essentially been a privilege that has been enjoyed by the few. As most of you are aware, the most vulnerable segments of society continue to be deprived of their right to a healthy environment, including the poor, children, different genders, different races, ethnicities, migrant populations, and other marginalized groups, including indigenous peoples and workers. Next slide. In my view, one of the major obstacles to the enjoyment of the human rights impacted by toxics and other environmental concerns is the question of what exactly is healthy, what is clean, what is safe. You may have noticed that a number of human rights are preceded by those terms, such as the right to clean and safe water, or the right to a healthy environment. But the question of what exactly is healthy, clean, or safe has basically been unaddressed by human rights bodies. Much of the focus within the human rights and environment discourse in the United Nations has been centered on procedural rights to information and participation in particular. And these are unquestionably important rights. But in the case of toxics, what concerns me is that they're largely inaccessible to the most vulnerable. And so, in my view, there's a gap here in international human rights law regarding when exposure is a human rights violation. There are certainly differing views on the topic among experts, and this is one of the things that I'll be working on in the coming years in terms of trying to clarify what are the different views and where there's some common understanding. So, for example, some experts say that it's only a violation of human rights if the exposure is above what an international body such as the WHO has determined to not constitute a risk to health. But leaves many substances that the WHO has not addressed to be unanswered in terms of what is a human rights violation. When is the exposure to these substances a human rights violation? And more importantly, it leaves the potential of human rights to prevent exposure and to help secure accountability for victims untapped. In my view, there's a broader ethical and moral question about exposure, one that has to bear in mind the science that we have today, but also to look towards shared values and principles that are grounded in human rights that hasn't been sufficiently discussed or analyzed. So in my view, to advance human rights in the environment substantially, whether the right to life, the right to health or safe, the right to health or to safe and healthy working conditions or safe water, clean air, adequate housing or a healthy environment, more generally, we have to focus on this substantive dimension and this question of when exposure is a human rights violation and what precisely a human rights-based approach can bring to the dominant approach, which is one that is centered on risk-based approaches. So next slide, please. In terms of looking at this substantive question, I wanted to just touch on a few examples. One of which is from the UK and the situation of air pollution in the United Kingdom. As some of you may be aware, 40,000 people die prematurely every year due to air pollution in the United Kingdom, a large portion of which is in the City of London. And thanks to public interest litigation relying on the duties of government to provide clean air, insufficient plans have repeatedly been rejected and revised by the government. London in particular has announced increasingly ambitious plans to address air pollution over the years, based in part on a narrative of a right to clean air, but also on substantive rights found in the law, which the attorneys have been using to reject insufficient air pollution plans. People are essentially claiming that their rights have been violated, and this has been leading to increasing calls for new clean air laws and policy guarantee of the right to clean air, and other provisions that would enhance the freedom from exposure to toxic air in the United Kingdom. Now, that being said, the problem still persists in the United Kingdom. There's no question about that. So we should be mindful that this human rights discourse and a rights-based approach is not necessarily a silver bullet. In fact, it seldom is, but rather just another tool that can be used in trying to find a path towards a non-toxic environment. However, I find these developments in the United Kingdom encouraging in terms of a demonstration of what human rights can do, although the pace of progress is far from what it should have been. Next slide, please. A second example I wanted to give is one of the export of banned pesticides. As many of you are aware, the United States and Europe have banned many hazardous pesticides in recent decades for health and environmental reasons, but they continue to export these banned pesticides to countries with even weaker systems to control their risks. This is a clear exploitation of double standards. It implicates a number of supply chains, from food to consumer products to tobacco production, in terms of the extraterritorial obligations of states when it comes to respecting human rights in foreign countries, as well as the human rights obligations of states that are importing these banned pesticides For example, one of the cases that the mandate has been working on is a situation involving tobacco production in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, like other countries in Africa, continues to have a challenging situation where child labor is implicated in economic activities and quite hazardous child labor at that, which is one of the worst forms of child labor. In terms of tobacco production, what we've seen is that many of the largest tobacco companies continue to use pesticides that are banned in Europe or the United States or elsewhere in tobacco production in Zimbabwe. And this has implicated, I believe, 9 countries and a handful of companies that are based in these countries, illustrating these double standards and what in my view is essentially turning a blind eye to one of the worst forms of child labor, which is children facing the risk of exposure to highly toxic and hazardous pesticides. But this practice is not simply about or isolated to pesticides, to the export of banned pesticides. Countries are effectively exporting air pollution. They are exporting hazardous manufacturing processes and other toxic processes to countries with weaker systems. Addressing these problems require both strengthening national systems in low and middle income countries to reduce the risks in these countries, but also simultaneously crafting stronger global treaties and other international controls to help ensure that this exploitation of communities and workers and essentially double standards is brought under control and it effectively ends. Today, I would have to say that we regulate less than 1/10 of 1% of toxic chemicals under international treaties throughout their life cycle. And in my view, this is enabling the exploitation of vulnerable groups in supply chains. And for this reason, I think the current paradigm that exists at the international level, which is to look at chemicals of global concern as being those that are transferred by air and wind and water, and only those through those medium across borders is outdated. Through globalization, what we've seen is that global supply chains are today a predominant method by which toxic threats are transferred across borders. So next slide. So just to conclude, I would have to say that human rights law, in my view, is largely untapped in terms of its potential to help advance a non-toxic environment. I firmly believe that there's a great deal that can be achieved in terms of advancing a non-toxic environment through applying a human rights-based approach to many of the toxic threats that we're facing around the world today. In terms of my future work under the mandate, I've been requested by the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to look at the practice of exports of banned pesticides and other issues that are impacting indigenous rights, and I'll be presenting some of this work next month in New York, and continuing that work through 2020. And in September of this year, I'll present a report to the Human Rights Council outlining a final set of principles to protect workers' rights from toxic exposures. And following that, in October of this year, in my report to the General Assembly, I'll be presenting a report as essentially outlining to what extent, in my view, we have a right to be free from toxic exposure. Or in other words, when is exposure a human rights violation? In terms of country visits, I'll be taking a visit to Canada in the month of May. And in terms of all these reports and country visits or other cases that you wish to bring to my attention, inputs and allegations of violations or abuse in cases are always welcome. You're more than welcome to send any allegations that you wish to bring to my attention, either by email or through my website. And I believe you have all those details in front of you. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Baskut. I really appreciate that we have plenty of time for questions, and you raised so many directions that people could go in terms of what they'd like to discuss. So at this time, we'd like to invite questions and comments from our participants. If you would like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation. It's always nice to know where people are calling from and what kind of work they're involved in, if that's relevant. And when you are finished, it's helpful to mute your line again by pressing *2 so we don't end up with a lot of background noise by the end of the call. So again, *2 to unmute your line.
I'd like to ask, this is Martin Karazi with the California Department of Public Health. I'm an epidemiologist, environmental epidemiologist. I'd like to ask what is happening with you as far as intimidation from industry. Have you been experiencing that? How do you manage that?
Well, thank you so much. It's an interesting question, and it actually comes up a little more often than I'd like. One of the things that we as mandate holders under the UN Human Rights Council are able to enjoy, one of our rights, is diplomatic immunity, and as a result of this, I've been free from many of the harassments and threats that are faced by environmentalists in terms of slap suits or other threats. But that being said, it is a risk when we go to certain countries and we investigate certain cases. We do have to take necessary precautions. But it's a very real threat. But fortunately, I have more protections than most people who are working on the ground in trying to defend these rights. I'm grateful for that, but very mindful of what others must be facing on a daily basis, and the incredible stress that must create, and of course saddened every time I hear a human rights defender that's killed, essentially on average 1 per day, I believe, is the latest statistic.
Thank you for your question, Martin. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Sheila Cole. I'm an environment and health expert from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I've been working independently, but also for 3 decades through the Canadian Environmental Network. We work across the country, and a lot of my work is on the chemical management plan. So we have the potential meetings that are organized with Environment Canada and Health Canada, have meetings of government, industry, academia, and NGOs that come together. So we've been working together for a very long time now. And a gap that I see, which I would like to encourage you to address, but also to comment on with us today, is the need for a global reduction in chemical production. So we're looking at some chemicals, we're doing something about the worst ones, we're doing a bit here and a bit there to minimize things. So there's a lot of examination of the chemicals and categorization and so on of all of these chemicals. But the production keeps coming, and a new chemical for this, a new chemical for that. And so one of the challenges that we face is getting ahead of the curve and doing some things in advance, and that's one of the things that I see to be a huge gap that needs to be addressed in the narrative that you're talking about among colleagues like yourself, particularly within the UN structure, who have the advantage of meeting and discussing frequently.
Thank you so much for that comment and that question. And actually, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, I've had the opportunity to be involved in the UN's latest version of the Global Chemicals Outlook, which has been, well, it was launched at the UN Environment Assembly, but the full version should be forthcoming soon. And the figures in there are quite staggering. I think, if I'm not mistaken, by 2030, we will see chemical production double, with the largest portion of this increase being in low and middle income countries that have still not developed systems for sound chemicals management. And this certainly is a threat, and certainly something that was clearly witnessed last week with the explosions in China, which is just another one of a series of explosions, unfortunately and tragically. But what I want to also mention is what I see within the UN as being quite problematic narrative that seems to be developing. And I'm going to be quite frank here. It's this narrative that chemistry is necessary for sustainability, and chemicals are necessary for sustainability. And I think this narrative continues to be reemerging, and it's reemerging with increasing frequency within the UN, and it makes me quite concerned, because here we have chemical consumption and production that is skyrocketing, and the narrative is that this is somehow necessary for sustainability and sustainable development, while completely missing that 60%, I think, by European estimates, of the production volume of chemicals are toxic. And so what we have are two different chemical industries, one that could be advancing green chemistry and safer chemicals, and one that is continuing to expand the production and use of unquestionably toxic chemicals. So thank you for that comment and question. I agree with it fully.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Thank you, and I do want to make sure that we can get to several other people, because I know that there are several who would like to ask a question. So if folks could please try to just be a little bit brief in their question, that will help us get to more of them. We'll probably go over about five minutes or so. So I would say we have 5 to 10 more minutes for discussion.
Hi, this is
Hello.
David Dow. I'm a retired scientist and environmental activist living on Cape Cod. I was wondering what thoughts our speaker had on toxic chemicals that are in municipal solid waste, whether they're sewage, sludge, or combined animal feeding operations waste that's dumped into ponds.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's actually an interesting question. In my visit to the United Kingdom, one of the concerns that was raised was by local communities that were opposed to sludge being dispersed in their community, and the extreme nuisances that they were facing. And I've also been receiving information about some cases in the U.S. about pig farms and other industrial facilities that are creating massive amounts of sewage type waste, and the nuisances and the hazards that those are being created. And I think that clearly implicates a number of human rights across the board. And in many ways, it's something that hasn't again been fully addressed by the human rights discourse on the right to clean water, and which includes the right to sanitation. And I think that is definitely an area that needs to be better addressed in terms of linking human rights and environmental protections.
Thank you. If someone else would like to ask a question, please press *2. And for those of you who have already chimed in, if you could make sure to mute your line when you're done.
This is Barbara Warren.
I'm not sure who.
I'll defer to Barbara.
So Barbara first, and then the woman who was also trying to speak after that. If we could do it that way.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is Barbara Warren. I'm from New York with Citizens Environmental Coalition, and I wanted to ask about radioactive. If you get into that at all about radioactive elements and the problem they create, particularly with long-lived radionuclides and the exposure. We're right now very concerned about it entering the Great Lakes and then, basically exposing people for a long time period.
Thanks, Barbara, for the question. And the short answer is yes, that is an issue that's covered under the mandate. The Human Rights Council has not limited the scope of what is covered by hazardous substances and wastes. So radioactive substances are included. I've been working on the situation involving communities that feel that they are being forced to relocate back into areas of Fukushima that they feel are unsafe. And in fact, the government raised its level of safety from 1 millisievert per year to 20 millisieverts per year, which some feel is unsafe for children and women of reproductive age, and also workers that are being hired to clean up the radiation, the contamination.
Right.
So yeah. So it's a big issue, and certainly one that's increasing it with efforts to find low carbon solutions. So thank you.
Thank you.
And the person who was also trying to ask a question, you may go ahead.
Hi, this is Patty. My question is embarrassing for the entire United States, I think, but I noticed that the United States is, and I am from the United States, the entire of all the countries of the world who haven't approved or joined the Convention of the Rights of Children, it's the United States. And I know that we are not party to several other critically important UN treaties as well, like the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, etc. So my question, and maybe you can't say this on an open phone line, but I would like to know what your sense is of what can be done in the United States to move us toward not being the sole outliers on these incredibly important treaties.
That's a very good question. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I'm disappointed that we are not party to a number of conventions as well. The U.S. is, however, a party to the Minamata Convention on Mercury, and part of the reason for that is that there was strong political buy-in at the highest level of the importance of protecting human health and the environment from mercury pollution. But also there was a clever way of going around the Senate process that has prevented the U.S. from ratifying a number of environmental treaties, including the Basel Convention and others. So frankly, I think the issue is largely political, and it's an issue that is multifaceted, and one that I probably can't begin to address on the call right now. But the short answer is, I think simply there needs to be greater political pressure from the public. Although just thinking out loud, it certainly hasn't sufficed on the issue of climate change in terms of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Or
comment. Hi there.
Hi.
This is Michelle Lee. I'm with the Manhattan Project for Nuclear Free World. And I really want to thank you so much for the work you've done on Fukushima. We interact a great deal with citizens from Japan. We're based in New York. I just wanted to bring up a slightly separate point. One thing I really appreciate about your perspective of full fuel cycle with respect to toxins, and obviously that applies very much to radioactivity because of mining and waste disposal in minority and indigenous communities. But I'm wondering what mechanisms there are at the United Nations for less siloing of the people working on toxins and the people working on the full on literally emissions, climate emissions areas, because I was actually quite disturbed to see the IPCC scientifically and validly identifying nuclear as a carbon emissions free technology. Certainly, if you look at the full fuel cycle, that's absolutely scientifically false.
Well, thank you. I think that is a persistent challenge. The efforts in the UN on environmental health have largely carved out the issue of radioactivity from their efforts. So when you look at the quote unquote chemicals and waste cluster at the UN, the treaties and policy frameworks that are in place for toxic chemicals and wastes, they exclude radioactive substances, and that gives rise to what you are pointing out, I think, in terms of the ability of the UN to look more holistically at issues. I'm not familiar with the exact provisions of the IPCC that you're referencing, but that is also another issue. I mean, with the Minamata Convention on Mercury, there was a lot of optimism that there could be synergies between the Mercury Treaty and efforts for greenhouse gas mitigation, but frankly, that seems like it's been unfulfilled, to say the least.
This is Diana facilitating, and I did have a question. You said you were going to be doing a country visit to Canada, and I was wondering if that included any time spent in the circumpolar north.
Well, we haven't set the agenda for where we will be going during the visit, but that would be my intention to find a way to make it up there. The problem is, of course, the limited time span that we have and the amount of travel that it would take. But we certainly, one of the issues that we already know that we're going to be focusing on is the issue of indigenous peoples in Canada, and the issue of tar sands and other extractive industries that are in that area. So I'm optimistic that we can find a way, but unfortunately we do have limitations in terms of what we have to do in our 10 days.
Yes, well, we're looking forward to seeing the country report after your travels and sharing that. So I want to thank you again so much for being with us this morning, or this evening for you. And Baskut, is there any final remarks you'd like to add before we close out the call? Anything you didn't say that you'd really like to make a point of sharing?
No, just to thank you and your colleagues again for the opportunity, and for those on the call to take the time to listen to me and to ask some very good questions. I'm grateful, and again, my contact information is available to all of you, so please feel free to continue to ask any questions or raise any issues that you'd like to raise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I will be sending a link to the recording of today's call along with those resources that are on the last slide of Baskut's presentation, contact information and such. So that everyone should be receiving that tomorrow. Let's see, we'll have a call in April, but the speaker and date for that is still to be announced. And finally, a little pitch for supporting our work. Please consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics to support these monthly Che Alaska calls. And your contribution in whatever amount is right for you will help provide the support we need to continue bringing these calls each and every month. Thank you so much to everyone who called in today. Thank you, Baskut, for participating during your travel time in Turkey. We appreciate everyone's participation and your patience this morning when we had a little bit of a delay in our start time. If you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. 907-222-7714 is the number for Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Thanks again to everyone. Have a wonderful day.